The morning sun spilled over Crystal Lake, casting a golden glow across the rippling water. Birds sang from the pines, their calls mingling with the sound of water lapping gently against the old dock. For Daniel Collins, this was paradise, quiet, steady, timeless. He leaned back in the creaky rocking chair on his porch, sipping coffee from a chipped mug that had been in the family for decades. The cabin was more than a house. It was history carved in wood and stone. His grandfather, Henry Collins, had built it after returning from the war. Back then, Crystal Lake had been nothing but wilderness. No manicured lawns, no paved streets, no community standards, just water, trees, and the call of loons at dawn. Henry wanted a place where his children, and one day grandchildren, could live free from the noise of the world. He had bought not just the cabin site, but a wide stretch of the land surrounding the lake, ensuring that no one could ever crowd them out. For decades, the cabin remained untouched by time. Daniel had inherited it after his father passed, and while the world around the lake had changed, the cabin stayed the same. But the lake itself had not been left alone. In the late 1990s, developers discovered Crystal Lake. It wasn't long before luxury homes sprouted along its banks, giant glass structures with perfectly trimmed lawns and driveways full of expensive cars. With those homes came rules, and with those rules came the Homeowners Association, the HOA. The HOA, at first, claimed it was only meant to protect property values, but it soon became clear it was about control. They dictated the color of fences, the type of siding, even what flowers could be planted in front yards. And in time, they turned their gaze to Daniel's cabin. From their perspective, the old log structure was an eyesore. It wasn't painted in neutral tones. It didn't have a perfectly paved driveway. Its dock was made of weathered boards, not aluminum and vinyl like the others. To the HOA board, especially its president, Brenda Whitmore, the cabin was an embarrassment. The first letter came one summer afternoon. Daniel had returned from fishing to find a neatly folded envelope tucked in his mailbox. "Dear Mr. Collins," it began, "you are in violation of HOA Code 14B, requiring uniform external property appearance. You must repaint your cabin in an approved color palette within 30 days. Daniel had laughed and tossed it in the fire pit that night. His cabin had stood for half a century before the HOA existed. No one was going to tell him what color to paint it, but the letters didn't stop. Soon they accused him of dock violations. Then it was his gravel driveway. Then it was the woodpile stacked neatly near his shed. Each notice came with fines, hundreds of dollars at first, then thousands as the weeks passed. Daniel ignored them all. Neighbors began whispering. He saw them as he drove into town. The way they looked at him like he was some outlaw, some troublemaker refusing to follow the community rules. The HOA board, of course, fueled the fire. Brenda loved to remind residents at meetings that one man's refusal to comply can drag down all of our property values. Daniel didn't attend those meetings. He had better things to do, but the tension was growing. One evening in early autumn, the problem came to his doorstep. Literally. Daniel was splitting firewood when he heard footsteps crunching on the gravel drive. He looked up to see a woman marching toward him, clipboard in hand. She was tall, thin, with sharp cheekbones and a permanent scowl carved into her face. Her blonde hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her pressed blouse looked like it had come straight from a catalog. "Mr. Collins?" she asked, her voice tight and cold. Daniel set down the axe, wiping sweat from his forehead. "That's me." She thrust a paper toward him. "You are in violation of multiple HOA regulations. You've ignored repeated warnings and fines. This is your final notice before we begin the eviction process." Daniel stared at the paper, then back at her. "Eviction? From my own home?" "Yes," she said matter-of-factly. "The board has voted. You have 30 days to vacate or bring your property into compliance. Otherwise, legal action will begin." Daniel let out a laugh, short and sharp. "Lady, you must be joking." "I am not joking, Mr. Collins," Brenda snapped. "Your cabin is not only an eyesore, but your refusal to follow community rules threatens the value of every home on this lake. We will not allow one man to ruin what we've built here." Daniel stepped closer, his eyes steady on hers. "Let me explain something. This cabin was here long before your community existed. My grandfather built it. My family has lived here for generations. You don't have the authority to evict me from my own land." Brenda sniffed, flipping through her clipboard. "This property falls within HOA jurisdiction. The rules apply to you as they do to everyone else. If you won't comply, we'll have no choice but to take it from you." For a moment, Daniel considered telling her the truth, that the cabin didn't just sit on some HOA lot, that his family's deeds stretched far beyond what she imagined, that he owned not just this cabin, but the lake itself, and even the only parking lot the HOA relied on for its endless barbecues and holiday parties. But he stopped himself. Now wasn't the time. Instead, he leaned back against the woodpile and gave her a slow smile. "You do what you think you have to. I'll be right here." Brenda narrowed her eyes. "You'll regret this, Mr. Collins." With that, she turned on her heel and marched back down the drive, her heels crunching on the gravel. Daniel watched her go, shaking his head. He knew one thing: the fight had only just begun. That night, as the wind rustled through the pines, Daniel sat on his porch staring out at the lake. He thought of his grandfather, who had fought for every inch of this land. He remembered the stories of county officials who once tried to seize it for development, and how Henry had stood firm with deeds and maps spread across the courthouse table. Daniel smiled. Brenda and her HOA thought they could scare him with letters and fines. They had no idea what they were up against. The lake shimmered under the moonlight, calm and steady. It had been his family's sanctuary for generations, and he would not let anyone take it away. For the next 2 weeks, the pressure from the HOA mounted like storm clouds on the horizon. Every few days, Daniel found another envelope in his mailbox. Each one bore the HOA's seal at the top, printed on crisp paper with legal-sounding jargon. Notice of fine, notice of violation, notice of eviction proceedings. They stacked up on the kitchen counter unopened. Daniel made a habit of tossing them there after skimming the first line, but Brenda wasn't satisfied with letters. Soon, the HOA board members began showing up in pairs, walking the edge of Daniel's property as if they were inspectors. They took photos of his dock, pointed at his stacked woodpile, and shook their heads as though they were surveying a crime scene. "Looks unsafe," one of them muttered loudly one afternoon, his voice carrying across the lake. "Non-compliant," the other replied, jotting notes into a little black book. Daniel ignored them, baiting hooks for his next fishing trip. But inside, his patience was thinning. The pressure wasn't just coming from the board, it was seeping into the community. When Daniel went into town for supplies, he felt the stares. At the hardware store, one neighbor hesitated before saying hello, then quickly muttered, "You should just follow the rules, Dan. Everyone else does." Another neighbor, a man with a brand-new SUV, crossed the aisle to avoid him in the grocery store. Word was spreading that Daniel Collins was the problem. The HOA made sure of it. Brenda held a meeting where she called Daniel's cabin a safety hazard and his refusal to comply an act of selfishness against the entire community. She told residents that his decaying property could drag down their home values by thousands of dollars. People believed her. After all, she was the president. For Daniel, it was almost amusing, if it weren't so infuriating. His cabin wasn't decaying. It wasn't unsafe. It was solid, built to last, maintained by his own hands. The problem wasn't the cabin. The problem was that it didn't look like the million-dollar houses surrounding it. But Daniel stayed quiet. He knew Brenda and her board were building up to something bigger. And he was ready. It came on a chilly morning in late October. Daniel was chopping kindling when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A black SUV pulled into his drive and out stepped Brenda, dressed in a thick wool coat, clipboard in hand. 2 other board members trailed behind her like bodyguards. "Mr. Collins," Brenda said, her tone sharp and businesslike, "we've given you every opportunity to comply. You've ignored every warning, every fine, every notice. The board has voted unanimously to evict you." Daniel leaned on his axe handle, raising an eyebrow. "Evict me, huh?" That's correct, Brenda continued. She handed him a stack of papers, the legal language bold and intimidating. You are to vacate this property within 30 days. Failure to do so will result in legal action and forcible removal. Daniel flipped through the papers without reading. The words were meaningless to him, bluffs written on expensive letterhead. Still, he played along. "And where exactly do you expect me to go?" he asked. "That's not our concern," Brenda replied. "But this cabin is no longer acceptable within our community standards. It has to go." Daniel chuckled, a low, steady sound that seemed to unsettle the board members behind her. He tossed the papers onto a stump. "Tell me something, Brenda," he said. "Do you actually believe you can evict me?" Brenda lifted her chin. "The board has authority over all properties within Crystal Lake Estates. That includes yours." For the first time in weeks, Daniel allowed himself to smile. A slow, dangerous smile. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to a pair of chairs on the porch. "I think it's time we had a little history lesson." Brenda hesitated, but curiosity got the better of her. She sat stiffly in one chair, her two board members hovering behind her like vultures. Daniel went inside and returned with a thick leather folder. The edges were worn, the papers inside yellowed with age. He set it on the table and flipped it open. "These," Daniel said, "are the original deeds to this property. Purchased by my grandfather in 1946. See that signature? That's his." Brenda frowned, leaning closer. "And what does this prove?" Daniel turned another page, revealing a large county map marked in faded ink. "This," he continued, "shows the boundaries of the land he bought, not just this cabin, not just the shoreline, the entire eastern half of Crystal Lake, every inch of it." The board members shifted uncomfortably. Daniel turned another page. "And here's the deed to the old parking lot by the boat launch. Bought it cheap in the 1950s, back when nobody wanted it. Guess who owns it now? Me." Brenda's face paled slightly, but she forced a laugh. "That can't be right. The HOA maintains the lake. We own the access roads. The parking lot belongs to the community." Daniel leaned forward, his eyes steady. "No. You maintain what isn't yours. You build docks on water you don't own. And your residents park their SUVs on my land every time they come for a barbecue. Don't believe me? Check the county records. It's all there." The silence that followed was heavy. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. Brenda's lips pressed into a thin line. "Even if this is true, it doesn't matter. The HOA still has authority here." Daniel closed the folder with a thud. "No, Brenda, you don't. You never did. This cabin was here before your HOA existed, and it'll be here long after you're gone. Try to evict me again, and I'll fence off the parking lot and close the lake. Let's see how your community enjoys itself then." Brenda stood abruptly, her face flushed with anger. She snatched her clipboard, glaring at Daniel. "This isn't over," she snapped. "You'll regret challenging us." Daniel leaned back in his chair, calm as ever. "We'll see." She marched back to her SUV, her two board members scrambling after her. The vehicle roared to life and sped down the gravel drive, kicking up dust behind it. Daniel watched them go, then turned his gaze back to the lake. The water shimmered under the pale autumn sun, steady and unbothered. He felt the same way, calm on the surface, but with depths no one could measure. The HOA thought they could bully him into submission with their rules and fines. But they had just learned the first lesson. Daniel Collins wasn't a man who could be pushed around, and the battle had only just begun. For a few days after the confrontation, the lake was quiet. Daniel spent his mornings fishing and his afternoons splitting wood, the stack growing taller with each passing week. The air was crisp now, leaves turning gold and red, drifting across the surface of Crystal Lake. It should have been peaceful, but Daniel knew it was only the calm before the storm. The HOA wasn't finished. Brenda wasn't the type to admit defeat, especially not in front of her board. And sure enough, the storm arrived. Brenda called an emergency board meeting the very next evening. She arrived, flustered but determined, clutching her clipboard like a weapon. The board members gathered in the clubhouse, a sleek building with polished floors and framed photos of smiling families boating on the lake. Photos. Daniel couldn't help but notice all featured his shoreline in the background. Brenda stood at the head of the table. "Mr. Collins believes he owns the lake," she announced, her tone dripping with disdain. "And he claims he controls the parking lot by the boat launch. He's bluffing. He's trying to intimidate us." A murmur spread through the room. One man, Tom Jensen, raised his hand. "What if he's not bluffing? What if he actually does own it? I mean, his family has been here longer than anyone else," Brenda snapped. "Nonsense. The HOA was founded to manage this community. We've maintained the lake for years. That makes it ours." But doubts had already begun to creep in. Another board member, Susan, frowned. "Maintenance isn't ownership, Brenda. If he has the deeds, we could be in trouble." Brenda waved her hand dismissively. "I'll prove him wrong. We'll check the county records ourselves. Then we'll see how smug Mr. Collins feels." It didn't take long. A trip to the county courthouse and a few hours in the archives was all it took to confirm Daniel's claim. The records were clear. The deeds were real. The Collins family had owned not only the land where the cabin sat, but the eastern half of Crystal Lake, stretching into the water itself. They also owned the gravel lot by the boat launch, the very lot the HOA relied on for community events and overflow parking. The news hit Brenda like a punch to the gut. She tried to argue. She tried to spin it. "The records are outdated," she insisted. "They'll never hold up in court." But the board members could see the panic in her eyes. By the end of the meeting, whispers filled the room. Residents were starting to wonder just how much authority the HOA really had. It didn't take long for word to spread. At the coffee shop in town, residents whispered about it over steaming mugs. "Did you hear? Collins owns the lake." At the hardware store, someone muttered, "My HOA fees were supposed to go to lake maintenance. Why are we paying if it's not even theirs?" By the end of the week, the truth had become the only topic of conversation in the community. Some residents were angry, not at Daniel, but at the HOA. They felt cheated, lied to. Others were nervous. If Daniel really did own the lake, what would that mean for their property values? Would he cut off access? Would he start charging fees? For Daniel, the sudden attention was uncomfortable. Neighbors who had ignored him for years were suddenly stopping by his driveway, asking questions. "Is it true?" one woman asked nervously, clutching her cardigan. "Do you really own the lake?" Daniel kept his answers simple. "Yes, my grandfather bought it decades ago." "And you're not going to keep us from using it, are you?" she pressed. Daniel smiled faintly. "As long as people respect it, I don't have a problem. I'm not here to make life harder. I just want to be left in peace." Word of his calm, reasonable attitude spread just as quickly as the truth about ownership. And with each retelling, Brenda's credibility crumbled a little more. One evening, as Daniel sorted through his grandfather's papers by the fireplace, he paused on a yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline read, "County officials attempt to seize land for development. Local man fights back." The photo showed his grandfather, Henry Collins, standing on the courthouse steps with the same leather folder Daniel now held in his hands. He remembered the stories his father used to tell. In the 1960s, a developer had tried to buy up the lakefront to build vacation resorts. The county backed the deal, eager for tax revenue. But Henry had stood firm. He'd marched into the courthouse, laid down the deeds, and told them flatly, "You can't sell what you don't own." In the end, Henry had won. The developers left, the county backed down, and the lake remained untouched. Daniel leaned back, staring into the fire. He felt a swell of pride. His grandfather had fought for this land once, and now it was his turn. By November, the HOA was in chaos. Attendance at meetings had dropped, and those who did show up demanded answers. "Why didn't you tell us Collins owned the lake?" one resident shouted. "Have we been paying fees for nothing?" another demanded. "You said you could evict him. Was that a lie too?" Brenda tried to keep control, but the harder she argued, the more defensive she sounded. "He's dangerous," she insisted. "If we let him, he'll ruin everything we've built here." But no one was convinced anymore. At one particularly heated meeting, Tom Jensen finally stood up and said what everyone else was thinking. "Brenda, the problem isn't Collins. The problem is you." The room went silent. Brenda's face went red. She stammered, but no words came. For the first time, she looked powerless. Daniel didn't attend the meetings. He didn't need to. The gossip that drifted across the lake told him everything he needed to know. He spent his days as he always had, fishing, chopping wood, patching the cabin roof before winter. But inside, he couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction. The HOA had tried to threaten him. They had tried to scare him, to isolate him, but now their own lies had caught up with them. The board was divided, the residents angry, and Brenda was losing her grip on power. One frosty morning, as Daniel sipped coffee on his porch, he saw Brenda's SUV drive past. She didn't slow down. She didn't glare. She didn't even look at him. Her eyes stayed fixed on the road, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. Daniel smiled into his mug. The truth had come out. And now there was no going back. Winter had begun to settle over Crystal Lake. Frost clung to the edges of the dock in the mornings, and a thin layer of ice crept along the shoreline. The cabins and houses around the lake were dotted with wreaths and holiday lights. But the mood in the community was far from festive. The HOA was collapsing. Attendance at meetings had dwindled to half of what it once was. Residents were no longer interested in Brenda's speeches about community standards or her warnings about property values. They wanted answers. They wanted accountability. And most of all, they wanted peace. For weeks, Brenda had avoided Daniel's gaze whenever she drove by his cabin. Her once confident smile was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped scowl. The board was fractured, arguments breaking out during every session. Some members wanted to resign. Others wanted Brenda removed entirely. And Daniel? He had stayed quiet watching it all unfold from his porch. But he knew the time had come to speak. It wasn't an official invitation, of course. Nobody would have dared ask Daniel Collins to attend an HOA meeting after everything that had happened. But whispers reached him all the same. "They're meeting this Saturday," one neighbor said while passing him on the trail. "It's going to be ugly. You should be there." Daniel considered it. He didn't like wasting evenings listening to Brenda drone on about lawn heights and mailbox colors. But this wasn't about bylaws anymore. This was about drawing a line in the sand. When Saturday arrived, Daniel put on his old flannel coat, tucked the leather folder of deeds under his arm, and walked into enemy territory, the HOA clubhouse. The room fell silent the moment he stepped through the door. Heads turned, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Brenda was at the front of the room, standing behind the podium, her clipboard clutched tightly. For the first time, Daniel noticed the cracks in her armor. Her shoulders were tense, her eyes darted nervously across the crowd. "Mr. Collins," she said stiffly, her voice thin. "This is a private meeting." Daniel ignored her and walked to the center of the room. He set the folder down on a table and faced the residents. "I won't take much of your time," he began, his voice steady. "But I think it's time we settled this once and for all." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some nodded in encouragement. Others simply leaned forward, eager to hear what he had to say. Brenda slammed her hand against the podium. "You have no right—" "Quiet, Brenda," Tom Jensen interrupted from the back. The room erupted in whispers. Daniel opened the folder, laying out the deeds, maps, and records for all to see. "My grandfather bought this land in 1946, he said. He built the cabin with his own hands. He made sure his children and grandchildren would always have a place here. And he didn't just buy the cabin lot. He bought the lake. He bought the parking lot. He bought everything this community has been using for decades." He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. "I've never asked for a dime from any of you. I've never stopped you from swimming in the lake or parking your cars on that lot. I could have, but I didn't. All I wanted was to be left in peace." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Someone clapped quietly. Daniel's eyes swept the room. "But when the HOA threatened to evict me from my own home, when they treated me like a criminal for living in the place my family built, I realized something had to change. So here's my promise. If you leave me alone, I'll leave you alone. Keep your parties, keep your barbecues, keep your boat launches. I won't interfere. But if anyone tries to threaten me again, if anyone tries to take what's mine, I'll fence off the lot and close the lake. And then you'll see what it means to live without what my family has given freely." The room fell into stunned silence. It was Susan, one of the board members, who finally spoke. "He's right," she said softly. "We've been bullying him for nothing. The lake isn't ours. The parking lot isn't ours. We've been lying to ourselves and to the community." Dozens of heads nodded. People began whispering, this time not about Daniel, but about Brenda. Brenda's face was flushed, her hands trembling as she gripped the podium. "He's manipulating you," she cried. "He's dangerous. If we let him get away with this, he'll ruin the community." But her words rang hollow. Nobody believed her anymore. Tom Jensen stood, his voice firm. "No, Brenda. You ruined the community. You turned neighbors against each other. You lied about what we owned. And you tried to evict a man from his own home?" The crowd erupted in agreement. Brenda stammered, her eyes wide as she looked around the room. But there was no saving her now. The tide had turned. Within minutes, a motion was raised to remove Brenda as HOA president. It passed almost unanimously. She tried to argue, tried to threaten legal action, but nobody listened. By the end of the meeting, she was out, stripped of her title, her authority gone. She stormed out of the clubhouse, her heels clacking against the tile. Nobody followed her. Daniel gathered his folder, tucking it back under his arm. As he walked to the door, a man stopped him. "Thank you," he said simply. Daniel gave a small nod. "I didn't do it for thanks. I did it for my grandfather and for my peace." Winter deepened over the next few weeks. Snow blanketed the ground, the lake froze solid, and the houses around the shore lit up with Christmas decorations. But for the first time in months, the community felt calm. The HOA, stripped of Brenda's control, became something smaller, quieter. No more endless fines, no more threats, just a group of neighbors trying imperfectly to get along. And Daniel, he finally had the peace he'd wanted all along. On Christmas Eve, he sat by the fire in his cabin, staring out the frosted window at the lake. The glow of holiday lights shimmered faintly in the distance, reflecting across the frozen water. He thought of his grandfather, of the battles he'd fought to keep this land safe. He thought of his father, who had passed it down to him. And he thought of the future, one where his children, and their children, could sit on this same porch, listening to the wind in the pines, free from the chains of rules and petty power struggles. The cabin stood firm, as it always had. The lake stretched wide and silent, untouchable. And when Brenda's car passed by that night, her headlights sweeping briefly across his porch, Daniel saw her glance his way. For the first time, she didn't glare. She didn't scowl. She simply looked away, defeated. Daniel leaned back in his chair, a quiet smile on his face. The battle was over, and he had won.